Praise be to Jesus and Mary. The Lord brings to naught the plans of nations, as we see in the case of Babel. Bab-el means the gate of God, that's what they were trying to build, but they wound up simply babbling in languages that their co-workers couldn't understand. The tower was supposed to be a gate for God, a stairway to connect the city to heaven, but you can't do that by human effort. Their pride and presumption concern God, who confuses their languages to keep them from cooperating in other ill-conceived projects that would lead them into idolatry. While he brings to naught the plans of the nations, the plan of the Lord stands forever. Nothing can go wrong with God's plan, because he knows everything, the past, the present, the future. He conceives his plan with infinite wisdom, and has at his disposition infinite power to execute it. But he does not plan things the way we would, and this is why St. Peter and the other disciples found it inconceivable that Christ would be killed in yesterday's Gospel. They thought that if God had granted victory to his Christ, and if Jesus could do miracles of all sorts, he would have no trouble establishing himself as king in Jerusalem. He could bring down fire from heaven to consume any Roman soldiers who got in his way, and God would put all of his enemies under his feet. Isn't that what Scripture says? God will put all his enemies under his feet. And yes, it is, but that's not quite how God meant that. So after the first clear announcement of his passion and death clearly went over their heads, Jesus starts an intensive training program, especially for his closest disciples. But the first lesson is so important that he calls the whole crowd together so that they will hear it too. Because the cross is fundamental to how God orders things. It's fundamental to his plan. Because the real problem in this world is sin, not Roman soldiers or Russian soldiers or any other. Sin is committed because of unmortified desires. We need to learn that it is better to deny ourselves pleasure than to sin. It is better to suffer something than to sin. It is even better to die than to sin. He who wishes to save his life will lose it. You can try to save yourself from death or from an unpleasant life by committing sin, but you aren't guaranteed success. Even if you do succeed, you won't live forever. Those who live forever are those who die in God's grace and then rise in glory. And this is the life that you lose if you choose to sin to save your present life or to make your present life better. So self-denial and sacrifice are necessary for anyone who wants to be a disciple of Christ. And that shouldn't surprise us. Nothing much can be accomplished in this world without some kind of sacrifice. But somehow we keep hoping that we can get by without sacrifice or get by with less sacrifice. We need rather to be generous, and that's what the 7 holy founders of the Servites did when they were invited by Our Lady to deny themselves and take up their crosses. They received in return everlasting glory. They were young men from Florence in the Middle Ages, merchants who were members of the most prominent families of the city. From their childhood, they had been occupied more with spiritual than with temporal matters, but nevertheless they were wealthy merchants. Between 1225 and 1227, so about the time St. Francis died, they joined the main confraternity of the Blessed Virgin in that city in Florence, and in it they became good friends. All 7 grew daily more detached from the world and devoted to the service of the Blessed Virgin. The eldest of them was called Bonfiglio Monaldo. He became their leader and would later be the first superior of the Servites. They all felt called to a life of renunciation and to be more generous in carrying their cross, and so prayed to Our Lady for light to see what it was that God was calling them to, or what it was that Our Lady was calling them to. And on the feast of the Assumption, as they were absorbed in prayer, they saw her in a vision and were inspired to withdraw from the world to a solitary place and to live for God alone. 4 of the 7 were married, or had married, and so 2 of them were now widowers, but still they had children they needed to provide for. So they couldn't leave immediately. They had to organize things to provide for their family, for their dependents, the wife and in the case of 2 of them, and the children in the case of 4. And so in 1233, once they had had provided for their dependents and then given the rest of their money to the poor, they withdrew to a house outside the gates of Florence. There they received the habit of the order of penitents, of people who were doing penance for their sins, much as St. Francis and the first brothers started the Franciscans. It was the chaplain of the confraternity who gave them this. He was their spiritual director. But this house turned out to not be solitary enough. They were disturbed by constant visitors, and when they went into the city, people pointed them out in admiration. And they didn't want that. They just wanted to live quietly in penance and prayer for Our Lady. So the following year they moved further away, settling 11 miles outside the city on the wild slopes of Mount Senario, where they lived in rustic conditions. Their fame of sanctity attracted people who made the journey out there to see them, who wanted to join them even. But they turned them down because they had not been called to become a religious order, at least not yet. After 5 years on the mountain, the future Pope Celestine IV came to visit them in the company of their bishop. And he admired what they were doing. He admired their fervor, their prayer, but he was concerned by the austerity of their life, which seemed to him excessive. And so he urged them to adopt a religious rule and to live more like men than like wild beasts in the forest. After this, the holy founders had a vision of Our Lady, who appeared to them holding a black habit that they were to wear, and told them to adopt the rule of St. Augustine. From that date, April 13th, 1240, they were known as the servants of Mary, or the Servites for short. This gradually transformed them from a group of hermits into a mendicant order, like the Franciscans or the Dominicans or Augustinians. The bishop wanted to ordain the founders priests, and all of them, 6 of them accepted. St. Alexis instead wanted to remain a lay brother and serve the others. He would have a very long life, lived to 110 despite his harsh penance, and in some sense thanks to his harsh penance. Now that they were in order, they began to accept vocations, and besides expanding the buildings on Monte Senario, they also opened houses in other cities at Siena, Pistoia, Arezzo. These were the first. But the order then continued to expand. Later they decided they needed other houses also at Florence, and the house where they had begun living together became another of their religious houses. The order received definitive papal approval in 1304, after various other forms of partial approval. But the only founder who lived to see that definitive approval was St. Alexis. He also transmitted to posterity the early history of the order, and helped to get his niece started in religious life. She was Saint Juliana Falconieri, and she became the foundress of the religious sisters of the Third Order of Servites. So the Servites are known particularly for propagating devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows, and in particular for the Rosary of the Seven Sorrows of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which we'll pray after Mass today. So we see how, in this case, as in all cases, the plan of the Lord stands forever. Praised be Jesus and Mary.